All right, today we're going to tackle one of the most debated verses in the entire Quran. We're going to dive deep into a modern feminist interpretation that really challenges centuries of tradition. And it does it by asking a really simple but powerful question. What if we've been reading one crucial word wrong this whole time?
Everything hinges on this one phrase, a phrase that has had a huge impact on how Islam and the role of women have been seen for centuries. For so many people, it's a really difficult and seemingly unavoidable part of the text.
And that brings us to the central question we're digging into today. Is this an explicit divine command for husbands to discipline their wives, which is how it's often been understood? Or could there be another way to read it? Could a closer look at the language of the Quran itself reveal a totally different meaning, one that's been buried under layers and layers of cultural interpretation?
Okay, let's get into it. Before we can really appreciate the new reading, we've got to first understand the traditional one and the serious ethical problem it creates for so many people.
So for centuries, this verse has been seen as a kind of three-step guide for a husband dealing with his wife's nushuz. Step 1, you admonish her. Step 2, you separate from her in bed. And step 3, the one that causes all the controversy, you strike her.
Now here's what's so fascinating. That whole framework, the entire logic of punishment, it all hinges on the meaning of that single word, nushuz. The argument is, if we get that word wrong, we get the entire verse wrong. So let's follow our first clue.
Traditionally, nushuz is defined as a wife's sinful rebellion against her husband's God-given authority. And you can see how that framing immediately changes everything, right? It casts the husband as the judge and the disciplinarian, and his actions become a kind of justified punishment.
But this new reading says, hold on, what if we try a different method? What if we let the Quran be its own dictionary? Instead of relying on what later scholars said, let's look at every single time the root of this word, nushuz, shows up in the text. And when you do that, a very different pattern emerges, one that has nothing to do with sin.
It turns out, based on how it's used across the entire Quran, the core meaning of nushuz is about rising up, elevation, or creating physical distance. So this completely reframes it. It's not a moral failure anymore. It's the physical and emotional act of pulling away within a relationship.
Okay, on to our next clue, and this one is a real plot twist that makes the traditional reading even trickier. In the very same chapter, another verse talks about a wife fearing nushuz from her husband. Now, if nushuz means a wife's sinful disobedience, how can a husband possibly be guilty of it?
And this is where it all clicks into place. In that verse about the husband, the word nushuz is paired with another term, irad, which means to turn away emotionally. So you have nushuz, the external, physical distancing, and irad, the internal, emotional rejection. It's a beautiful description of a relationship drifting apart, both body and heart. It's not a crime, it's a crisis.
And that one insight just changes everything. If nushuz isn't some unique sin that only a wife can commit, but it's actually about relational distance that either partner can start, well then the goal of the verse can't be punishment anymore. The whole objective shifts from disciplining a subordinate to healing a rift between two equals.
So you have to ask yourself, if the linguistic evidence seems to be pointing so clearly toward reconciliation, how on earth did this idea of punishment become the dominant one for more than 1,000 years? To figure that out, we have to do a little historical detective work.
When we trace the history, you can see a clear pattern. In the early centuries, the meaning was shaped by the social norms of the time. A little later, powerful legal schools made it official, calling it a husband's legal right. And then it even became a tool for enforcing the social and political order of the state. The interpretation just kept moving further and further away from the text itself.
So what really happened is that the legal and cultural ideas of those times were read into the verse. The text started to look more and more like the patriarchal systems of those societies, instead of being interpreted through the Quran's own vocabulary.
Okay, so let's bring it all together. We have this new context, nushuz means distancing, and the goal is reconciliation. Now let's go back to that original verse and see how it completely reframes those three steps.
All of a sudden, it's not a ladder of escalating punishment. It's a roadmap for communication, for bridging a gap. First, you talk about the problem. If that doesn't work, you create physical space, not to punish, but as a way to communicate that there's a serious rift. And that sets the stage for the final step.
And here's the clincher. If the first two steps are about communication and trying to heal a divide, the final step has to serve that same goal. An act of violence makes absolutely zero sense in a process of reconciliation. So this reading argues the word cannot mean strike to punish. Instead, if you look at other ways the root word is used, it suggests an alternative meaning, something like to separate or to go away from them. This would make the final step not an act of violence, but a more decisive separation, to break the impasse and hopefully prompt a real resolution.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Why does this deep linguistic detective work actually matter in the real world, beyond just being an academic debate? You see, the real game changer here isn't just one new definition for one tricky word. It's the method itself. It's this disciplined commitment to letting the text speak for itself, treating it like its own dictionary, and freeing it from the weight of all those later cultural and legal ideas that might have clouded the original meaning.
And what that does is it completely shifts the conversation. We move away from this endless cycle of either trying to defend or apologize for a really difficult verse, and instead we move toward a much deeper, more authentic engagement with the language and the internal logic of the scripture itself.
And that leaves us with one last big question. We've just seen how re-examining a single word through the text's own internal logic can transform a verse from what looks like a command for violence into a guide for reconciliation. It really makes you wonder, what other profound insights are just waiting there to be discovered in our ancient texts if we only dare to read them with fresh eyes?